Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rick Tell in the Box Zoomcast. Today's guest is Danny Lux, internationally renowned super composer of television and film. And he's been nice enough to give us some time today. And we're going to talk about his career and about his use of Steinberg products, and also about some of his new products with his company, his software company called Sample Fuel. So we're going to have a really good time here today. Okay, so let's get started. So, Danny, let's see here. You have, for those of you who don't know Danny's credits, I mean, I need like a whole page of notes just for the credits. He's done like, I don't know, 1,900 episodes or something of television shows. Um, let's see, we got here Grey's Anatomy pops out. That's one everybody knows. Boston Legal, NYPD Blue. It goes on and on. I mean, he's just a prolific and super talented guy who's been in the business now since what, 89, 88?
Well, I started working for Mike Post right out of high school in '87 and started composing on one of his series in '91.
Okay, so, all right, so you, right out of high school, so how did you meet Mike Post? How did you get that hookup? I mean, that's like a dream hookup.
It was a dream hookup, and it was one of those stories of fate. Somebody walked into the wrong place, and next thing I knew, I had a job. Um, so there was, well, first of all, in high school, I've been playing drums since I was like 10 years old and songwriting with a bunch of friends and bands since I was like 12 and wanted to go that route, growing up. But had always been aware of Mike Post and Pete Carpenter because they did about, every hit show in the 70s and 80s on TV.
Right.
And so there was a guy that worked for Mike Post as his assistant slash engineer in his office studio, and he was looking for a pro audio store called Everything Audio in Burbank at the time, and didn't know where it was, and he walked across the street into the wrong building, and it happened to be my dad's print shop, and he said, "Oh, I'm looking for this music store," and my dad, who normally was kind of a shy guy and not terribly supportive of the music thing, for some reason decided like to say, "Hey, my son's into music. What do you do?" And somehow got the phone number before Charlie walked across the street, and he said, "Hey, have him call this guy. Maybe they'll be hiring." I called, and back in '87, they were still doing live recording sessions for all the shows. And Mike Post owned the three keyboard setups and electronic drum setup. And I got hired to help Charlie, who was the guy that walked into the wrong place, um, basically cart all the gear to the sessions and help him set up and tech support, throughout the 3 hour or 6 hour session, whatever it was, and that's how it started.
Great. That's great. So, did you ever, going by the timeline, did you ever meet Pete Carpenter?
I wish I could say I did. Pete Carpenter he was already really sick.
Right. I know he
Um,
passed away around 89 or something, or 88, or.
it might have been even around '88 if I remember
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Like, because so I did the cartage thing and the tech setup thing for that season, and at the end of that season, Mike hired me to be his like, assistant slash gopher slash assistant engineer kind of guy. And I remember going over to Pete's house a couple of times to drop something off to his wife, but Pete was already so sick I never met him. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned Pete Carpenter because of the legacy. Okay, the legacy and how the business is that. So Pete Carpenter started with Earl Hagen,
Right.
and Earl Hagen was big in the 50s. I even have a book by Earl Hagen about writing for television. Earl Hagen
Hmm.
did the Andy Griffith Show. That's if you want to give him his time, his time zones.
Right.
And he was big. He was a trombone player, and a lot of the guys were horn players back, the composers.
Yeah, that's
A lot.
Pete was actually a trombone player in the Fox Orchestra before that.
Yeah. So you got um, Earl Hagen hands off the baton to Pete. Pete Pete then has a younger Mike. He works with because he was 20 years older than Mike, I think, something like that. And then of course then you take the baton from Mike as well. So it's really interesting how we stand on the shoulders, as they say in science, of giants. We learn and so the art continues, and that is really something that is difficult to emulate in a school. Uh, you know,
Right, definitely.
I'm not. There's a lot of recording schools now, and this thing and that thing, but yeah, but working with a master is like like there's no nothing that can replace that. That's really so
Yeah, totally agree.
yeah, yeah. So how did you get into composing? Um, my first band that I was in, I played drums too,
Hmm.
but I switched over back to keyboards, which I had been, as a started at 5, 6 years old playing, getting piano lessons. But I kind of like drifted between the keyboards and drums, and then I went back to keyboards because of the ability to write songs and to be more upfront
Right.
with. Uh, where did you? I mean, it takes. I have done some television and film, and it takes a lot of hard work, uh, crazy deadlines, but it takes and obviously a lot in composing, a lot of knowledge. How did you get your theoretical knowledge? I mean, you say out of high school.
Hmm.
So so at that point, were you taking music classes? How did you, or you
No, the
self-taught?
only thing self-taught except for drums. I grew up. My drum teacher lived two doors over from me as a very little kid, and
Uh-huh.
who was an amazing drummer. And I started taking drum lessons from him when I was 10 years old, and took drum lessons pretty serious until I was about 17 and a half with him. So uh, definitely learned a tremendous amount from that guy. But I started playing in bands from the age of about 12 years old, and I was the drummer. So we had band practice pretty much in my living room most of the time, and everybody left their gear there. So I was able to just like, hey, here's the keyboards and the synths, and I got to play with that stuff all the time, and just kind of self-taught, and eventually bought like a crappy piano, and just kind of picked it up, self-taught, and just would write a lot of songs for the band, and then I remember, my brother was 6 years older than me, and he was a good guitar player, and he's the guy that got me into music originally. And then I started picking up guitar a little bit around 13 or 14. And then I remember trading a guitar for a Fostex cassette 4 track when I was probably 15. And then I got obsessed with trying to figure out how to record and record myself or my band, but a lot of times just myself, just overdubbing all the parts. And eventually that led to getting a half-inch Tascam 8 track. And then by, I think, my junior in high school, one of the guitar players I was playing with got a little bit of money, and we ended up getting a 16-track Fostex kind of studio half-inch, and I was getting really, really good as an engineer and kind of a producer. And so, by the time I fell into the gig with Mike Post, it's like I was already really comfortable with mixing boards, some effects, and and multi-tracking, but I had zero experience at that point of any computer stuff or sequencing.
you have to have determination and work hard. It doesn't come easy. You have to spend the hours. I'm sure you spent many,
Definitely.
many a long day and a half in the studio at times.
Right.
That's what separates the serious, the talent and the determination and the dedication. But anyway, and just to add a little addendum to the Pete Carpenter and Mike Post, for those who again don't know, I mean, some of the stuff that they did, like the Rockford Files, Magnum, right. I mean, you name it in the '70s. I mean, they were,
In '80s. Yeah.
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 I mean, they did everything. Like you said, it was a very lucky opportunity. Um,
Oh, no question about it.
yeah, I mean, to
Yeah.
get like walking across the street and hey, Beethoven needs somebody
Right.
to help him with tune his piano or something. Let's go back now. So now you're recording. You start on the Fostex, um,
Hmm.
and I recall those. I actually had some experience working in music stores, but I worked at Sam Ash Professional in Manhattan.
Hmm.
I didn't work in the corner music store type thing, but I did work in the Same As Professional, which was really a great gig. And I hate working. I mean, not working, because this was when DigiDesign first came out, and they had their Sound Tools package with the software Sound Designer, which was the very first very first hard disk recording system. And so the DigiDesign in 1989, I believe it was, yeah, trained me because I worked
Hmm.
because I was selling their stuff. So I mean, that was like that was a very important time in audio, the advent
Right.
of disc recording. So how did you get involved in disc recording to disc? What was your first experiences? Was it Pro Tools, or how did you first?
No, I've never actually used Pro Tools, but my first audio interface actually was a DigiDesign one called Session 8. And
Okay, I
I
remember.
ended up,
Right.
yeah, and it wasn't a great interface, but so my progression while I worked at Mike's was once I started writing, um, I lived about 30 minutes from his studio, so I started setting up my own studio and eventually had like 24 track ADAT thing set up. And so I remember when we were doing LA Law together, um, I started recording it at my house on ADATs and would bring the rack to his studio and plug my ADATs in to finish up and mix over there. But once I, I saw Sound Tools and then started seeing the possibility of hard disk recording. We were using Performer back then on just a Mac Plus or whatever, and it occurred to me that somebody's going to start doing digital audio, and then so I ended up meeting, I think at like West LA Music or something. I met the eMagic guys. Um, Bob Hunt used to go around music stores, and I ran into him, and he was just like, "Oh no, we've got digital audio. You got to check it out." And he gave me some discs on floppy of Logic back then, and so I checked it out, and it was the first one to do hard disk recording, and I believe the only interface that worked at first was the DigiDesign Session 8, and so it locked you to just 8 tracks of audio, but it was just it was such a big difference. Well, now that I think about it, that might have been after Mike. I can't remember, or towards the end of my Mike Post days, which was in '96. I just remember uh, when I went on my own in '96. I, knock on wood, just got picked up a lot of steam real quick. I got three shows out of the gate. One was Sliders, one was Party of Five, and another one called Crisis Center. But Party of Five was all acoustic guitar, or mostly acoustic guitar, and I'd use a guy named John Gu a lot of the times, but a lot of times I'd play it myself, and I wasn't that good. So I just couldn't wait to start recording on a hard disk system, and it just made it so much easier for me to actually play my own parts on something like Party 5, where I could just, punch chord by chord or bar by bar or something. But that's how I got into it, and it made me switch to Logic at the time, which Logic's a great program, and I used it for a long time, but eventually got wooed by Steinberg and onto Cubase.
Now, were you were using Mac?
Yeah, back then I
Right,
was.
right,
Yeah.
right. All right. So was I. Matter of fact, my first sequencer was Performer. It's amazing. I mean, I tell students about the first computers we used for music.
Right,
Oh, I had 512K of RAM. Oh, wow.
right.
But anyway, yeah. But again, it was an exciting time. But the stuff was really new,
Hmm.
and today I mean, today it's so much better. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's an understatement.
yeah, yeah. I paid $15,000 in the '80s for a Kurzweil K250,
Right,
which was 12 voice polyphony, built-in 12 channel sequencer. I don't know. I remember I think 12-bit. Actually, it was 12-bit sampling too, but it did have a
right.
higher sampling. I had like 50K sampling with
Hmm.
12-bit, but $15,000. Today you can get that for about $500 or less. Well, you get
Right,
more. You get more, but I'm just saying you can get a synth that can do all that sampling like for fraction.
right.
But but in that time, you might have experienced this too. At that time, the only option to that was a synclavier,
Right,
and that
which
was
was
like to get
crazy.
one that could actually do anything was $100,000. Uh,
Yeah.
and even those were very unreliable. What did you first use as far as Steinberg, Cubase or Nuendo?
Um, the the first I ended up switching when they went to SX actually. When so after Cubase VST. So basically, I was on the Mac platform using Logic for a long time, and then I started beta testing Logic, and they convinced me to switch to the PC. When that was back when Windows XP was out, and
Right.
they're like, "Oh yeah, it works great. It's so much better than the Mac." I'm like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." I switched because I was having issues with the G4 Macs. I bought three of them, and all three of them went down, and so I was getting pretty down on the Mac platform at that point. So, anyways, I switched. It worked great, and then about 6 months later, Apple bought eMagic and discontinued the PC version. But I was so sold on the PC at that point um, that I just said, okay, what are my other options? And that's when Steinberg had just kind of dumped their Cubase VST software and started over
Mhm.
uh, from the Nuendo platform and Cubase SX, or it wasn't even called Cubase; it was just called SX back then. Um, was basically version one of what Cubase is now.
But I have a question to ask you. Now, when you were with Mike, was he work? Were you there when they did the Law and Order sound effect that everybody the clunk?
The famous sound effect.
Right.
Um, yeah, he. I started in the summer of '87, and Law and Order was a pilot for for CBS. I think right before I got there. Um, so and they passed on it. So which is hilarious since it's like
Yeah, like 7
made NBC.
shows.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But so Charlie Sidner and Mike Post, kind of worked on the pilot. Um, and at the summer of '88, Charlie quit, and I ended up at 19 years old getting Charlie's job as Mike's engineer, and that's when Law and Order was coming on the air. So it had already been done, but I had to like recreate that all the time in the first season. But technically, I think Charlie and Mike came up with it. I mean, the way it usually worked with Mike, he wasn't a hands-on guy with the actual equipment. He was more still, 6-line sketch, old school guy. Had his studio, but like, his engineer would always like produce up the stuff. So I suspect Mike probably explained exactly what he was looking for, and Charlie probably found the sounds. And um, I remember it was a layer of like two things. One of them was definitely Grand percussion patch from the D50, and I can't remember what the other one was, but technically I didn't come up with it. I'm sure Charlie did.
Hmm. And what is Charlie's last name?
Sydnor, Sydnor.
And is he still in the recording industry?
Yeah, I mean, he still composes, and he mostly does more music editing than composing.
Okay.
But yeah, he's still involved.
That's cool. That's cool. When did you start Sample Fuel, which is for those people who don't know, is a company that produces VST plugins for is it for strictly for Halion?
Yeah, yeah, it's just VST instrument plugins basically in the Halion platform.
Hmm.
It hasn't been around that long. I'd say we've only been around maybe a year and a half at the most. It basically started because I've been a Steinberg Halion user for forever now, um, for probably 20 years. And when I think it was Halion 4 or 5 came out and added a granular engine similar to the Pad Shop plugin that comes with Cubase. When they added that in, it kind of like was eye-opening to me of how easy it is to make great sounding pad type sounds for scoring with granular.
Hmm.
And so at that point, I just started making mostly my own sounds for my own scores. And when Halion 6 came out, that was when they finally opened up the architecture to where you can make your own custom interfaces, kind of like, or just how people make contact instruments with their own graphics and their own features and stuff like that. So I I had a particular workflow that I liked in Halion, but it still was kind of very complicated. And I just was with my assistant Jared here. I was just like, okay, well now we can make our own interface. Let's make our dream interface, so I can just use that instead of like, always have to tinker around with the actual Halion components. And then we thought, if we're going to do this, why don't we learn how to do it right and make it look good, and maybe we'll, if it comes out at a certain level of professionalism, maybe we'll actually release it. And so that's what we did. So it was a slow process to kind of figure out how to do this. There's a lot of scripting involved to make simple things happen, and neither one of us here are programmers. So my assistant Jared did a great job just, asking questions, figuring out some of these basic scripting functions and getting it to all work. And so initially, we have an instrument called Pad Motion, and that's the instrument I wanted to make from the get-go. And then it has engines of sample engine, granular. It also had the analog modeling engine and the wavetable engine, but mostly it was the sample and granular engine. But anyways, we made it with all four engines, and then it kind of was like, then it started to take shape as ideas for other instruments. Like, okay, let's strip off the analog one, let's strip off the wavetable one and make those independent instruments. And then once I had kind of three of those instruments made, then I got the show Manifest was coming on the air. So maybe Sample Fuel's actually been around more than 2 years now, because I'm starting my third year of Manifest, and I wanted all these reversing sounds. and I wanted to be able to have an instrument, if I could figure out how to make it, to where I could play phrases in real time, and instantly they would sound reversed. And the problem with when you're composing and writing phrases that you're going to reverse, you got to think of them compositionally backwards, because when you flip them around, they're
Right.
they're they're no longer in the order you played. So I wanted to figure out a way to make an instrument where I could play C D E F in a phrase, and then instantly it would sound like C D E F reversing, not F E D C. So that took me a while to figure out how to do that. Eventually I kind of figured out what kind of sample material would require that, and so we have an instrument called Revolution Create that does phrases from 1 beat to 2 bars, where you can just play in real time with 26 different instruments. And then we have a couple of other interesting instruments as well, but that's how it came to fruition. It was just basically I wanted to make the instruments I wanted to make, and then we thought, all right, let's put the extra mile of effort into it and make it so we could actually release it and start a little company.
Well, that's something for those people who are interested in scoring for film and TV. Um, Especially, each composer, each producer has their own sounds. If they don't use patches that everybody else uses, that doesn't work. You have to be original, and and more every year, sound design becomes as important as music. I mean, and some composers incorporate that in their work. Some don't. But sound design, I mean, like you can go through a score, and it's almost non-musical. Mostly sound effects. But
Right,
I mean, that wasn't the case 50 years ago.
right.
It was all melodies and such like that. But that's develop your own palette of sounds. That's very important.
We're going to be having a new instrument coming out. No firm date yet. That's It's going to be in the Pad Motion series that will have 4 layers, and they're all drag and drop.
Oh, cool.
Um,
I'd
so
love
you'll be able to do
to have
that
one.
instrument.
I'd love to check it when it's available. Just
Sure.
for our listeners that may or may not know what granular synthesis is. Granular synthesis is synthesis which an audio sample is chopped into very small bits and manipulated that way. Am I describing it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no scientist on the explanation of the synthesis, but yeah, it, the way my brain understands it and works is that, yeah, you can take virtually any source material, and you can freeze it down to minute little bits, or just a bigger piece, and it can loop and turn anything in a pad, but with and that would be one like grain. But then an engine like ours or Halion allows you to have multiple grains. You can put 4 grains or 6 grains or 8 grains or whatever it is, and get them to kind of overlap and smooth out. So like one grain may sound kind of stuttery, but as you add more grains and kind of have it move around a little bit, then it smooths it out to where it's imperceptible of
So, so
any
it's all
small
so
fraction.
it's all voodoo, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, but to me, it's just like one of the greatest sound designers ever is Eric, um, over at Spectrasonics, and he used to work for Roland. And then when he started his company, he had a very popular library that every composer overused to death, called Distorted Reality.
I've
And
heard of it.
and that would have sounds on it that I would be like going, how the hell did he get that sound? Like, what synth? And it wasn't until I discovered granular synthesis and I went, that's how he did it. That's those sounds. And so to me, I find granular synthesis so key in getting sounds that the ear just likes to hear in scores. It's just like, very easy mood setting kind of textures.
So with Revolution, with the samples provided, you can do that kind of manipulation, the granular manipulation.
Well, no, what's going on with all the Revolution is not really granular, but it's actually done with more sample layer engine technologies. But it's how the samples were sampled that allows you, whether they react as quarter note phrases, half note phrases, whole note phrases, or 2-bar phrases.
Right.
But Revolution, a lot of the patches give you a third granular layer with some material to add a more film score type pad along with it. And that's kind of where some of the best patches are, in my opinion. On there is a hybrid. It's like you have this pad, but then it's got all this cool reversing textures in it. So that's why there's a third granular layer for that instrument.
Gotcha.
It just kind of takes it to the next level of now being, oh, it's not just a simple phrase reverser. It's now like a pad machine / phrase reverser. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, that guys, go out and check it out. What is the price on that Revolution?
It's our most expensive instrument. It's $149. It was the most work to create, and I think it's the most unique one that we have. I don't think any other instrument does quite what that can do in terms of reversing the phrases in real time and keeping the order.
And what are some of the other titles that you have on Sample Fuel?
Well, we have Pad Motion, which is kind of, it is what it sounds like. It's focused on pads with motion in the sounds. All our instruments have similar quick controls down at the bottom. There's always a motion quick control. So if you got a patch that's using 1 layer, 2 layers, or 3 layers with all different motion, no matter what instrument you're using, if you turn that motion layer all the way to the left, it'll slowly make all the motion stop and just become just a straight pad. But we have an analog modeling synthesizer called Poly. We have a wavetable synthesizer called Wave. You can buy them separately, or you can buy them as a bundle. Steinberg also sells that, and that's basically $79. We have Revolution Create, we have Pad Motion, and we have one called Cycle Create, which is kind of an interesting instrument. It's got 4 layers of samples that cycle rhythmically. So based on what kind of LFO shape you have and what the beat division is, it'll go from layer 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back again in a rhythmic fashion, locked to tempo. And it's kind of an interesting instrument because it can, as it's cycling through different sounds, it can create interesting patterns. But if you use, say, a ramp kind of LFO shape, then it almost sounds like the layers are almost reversing into each other. And then, so you can control that in depth on how much they blend, what kind of shapes, how much they're reversing. And again, if you turn the motion off, then you basically have a 4-layer pad synth on that as well. And then we sell all of that bundled together as a production bundle for $299. And there's an instrument called Texture Create that you get for free in the production bundle. That is, it's kind of like Pad Motion, but the sample content is different. It's like Pad Motion has a ridiculous amount of sample content. I forget how many thousands of sources, or 1,100 plus, or whatever the sources are. But Texture is more like landscape sounding moods, and it's granular.
Mhm.
So some of the patches will be just straight pads that you can play, but others might be like, oh, it's in a minor key. So you hit A and you get an A minor kind of really interesting, moody landscape. So it can, it almost feels kind of like a shortcut. Like nothing's meant to be like an instant cue. Like I'm not a big fan of sample libraries you load that you hit one key and it's got like 20 different things going on and sounds like a complete cue. I'm trying to make sounds that only inspire you ideas or will enhance what you already have written. They're not meant to consume the entire sonic space. Most of the patches, especially in like pad motion, are really thinned out at times or EQ'd, uh, just so they'll sit in your track, not take it over and not be overwhelming. And
So
so
elements
texture,
elements of the audio to be
yeah,
to be
it's like so.
together.
If I'm looking for some sort of pulsing sound and I want it to be low, then great, it'll sound low. But sometimes I'll have pulses that are like super thin and meant to be the higher mid registers. So all the sounds I try to make usable for what I'm going to be doing, and and
Right.
even though the synths are capable of other genres of EDM and such, the patches are mostly focused on film scoring.
Right. Right. Great. Okay. Well, Danny, thank you so much for your time. It's
My
been
pleasure.
interesting sharing, reminiscing about your career and about all your great work in television and film. And again, thank you very much. And maybe we'll meet again at the webcast next year. We have some new stuff.
All right, Rick.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye bye.